Hi, I'm William Stewart, co-founder of Teleios. Welcome back to our verse-by-verse study on the Gospel of Mark. I'm so glad you're here. We are in the Christ first part of his ministry. I think many have called this the first Galilean tour. Remember, he is out ministering to people, presenting himself as Messiah, teaching, healing, staying away from Jerusalem uh, as to, in general, except the major feast of generally Pentecost, the Passover, I think not to ruffle feathers among people who would want to charge him with treason and put him to death, but stay out in the rural areas where people were more receptive to his message, to people to whom he wanted to speak. But as we read today, the Pharisees followed him everywhere. The Pharisees, of course, are probably the most numerous and perhaps most powerful of the Jewish leadership in Judea around Jerusalem. And they were threatened by Christ, his presence and message as the Messiah, because it would, if true, if he became king and established the eternal kingdom, as promised in the Old Testament, it would take away their power and money. So let's go to the text, verse 23 of chapter 2. And it came to pass, they went through the cornfields on the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath, the Jewish Sabbath, was the day of rest, one day a week on what we would typically call Saturday. You could do no work at all. And the Pharisees were very strong about this. And Christ's disciples began as they went to pluck the corn. And the Pharisees said unto him, meaning Christ, why do they, the disciples, on the Sabbath pick the corn? It's not lawful. Can't do work on the Saturday. They defined picking work or picking corn as work. And he said to them, have you never read what David did? When he had need and he hungered, he and that were with him. Otherwise, I think there were 400 soldiers or men following him. This was when he was running from Saul in 1 Samuel 21. And he went into the house of God, the temple, in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, and he did eat the showbread. The showbread was the sacred bread set out in the holy place outside of the Holy of Holies. And the only people who could eat it, I think, were the priest, and which is not lawful to eat but the priest. I just said that. So what do you know? And he gave unto them all that was with him. Otherwise, David was known as a valiant warrior, and people respected him and trusted him. He came with his men. They hungered, and he gave him that bread. And what's not in the text here is that Saul, King Saul, who was chasing David, he hated him, was jealous of him. In the next chapter, 22, killed those priests. I think 21 or 27 of them. Christ finishes here in verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. For the Lord, the Son of Man, meaning Christ, the representative man, is also Lord of the Sabbath. So, very interesting here. The Sabbath was sacred. They were not to do work. It was set down by the law of Moses. Yet later, the law was given to slaves, probably illiterate and probably a little wild, a discipline coming out of Egypt. And the law was given to organize them, teach them about God and Messiah, and how to worship, and to keep them separate from other countries so they would not fall into idol worship. And but as time went by, starting in the book of Deuteronomy and in the prophets, God wanted them to advance in their thinking. The law was strict. It kept them in line, much like you might do a 2-year-old. And yet, as a 2-year-old grows, you hope that they would learn to discern for themselves and do adult things. And I think God wanted them, the Israelites, to do this as well. In Matthew, in the corollary verse in chapter 12, he quotes Hosea 6:6, that God didn't want sacrifice or burnt offerings, but wanted mercy. And Micah 6, verses 6 to 8, really says the same thing. But Matthew quotes this verse twice, chapter 9 and chapter 12, emphasizing how God wanted his people to grow in maturity. And so he says the Sabbath, it's not, the greater good is not keeping the Sabbath in verse 26. It's there for man to show him his need for rest in the law, but in the time of the church, it'll be to show salvation in Hebrews chapter 4. So the Sabbath type salvation, it's not there for legalism. It's there to teach. It was there to make sure people in the Old Testament had rest for the good of man, not to be legalistic, not to obey the Sabbath, just to obey the Sabbath. That doesn't please God. As we know in Hebrews 11:6, faith pleases God in the Old Testament, in the Gospels, and in the epistles. So Christ rules the Sabbath too. The Sabbath does not rule Christ. Notice he's calling himself Lord here, and he's taking it's a transfer of a title of God in the Old Testament, Kyrios in the Greek, Adon, Adonai in the Old Testament for Lord, and Christ is taking that for himself, another sign of who he is. Now, going to chapter 3, Christ then entered a synagogue. Again, this is where teaching occurred by the rabbi, the man with the withered hand. He came and said, stretch it forth, and he healed them. Saying again to the Pharisees, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath day or do evil, to save life, to kill? But at this point, they didn't say anything. And he healed them. And in verse 6, the Pharisees went forth straightway and took counsel with the Herodians. The Herodians were the party of Jews working closely with the Herodian dynasty. King Herod died in 3 BC, but Herod Antipas was there at that time. And I think also Agrippa I was either in power or would soon be in power at this time, descendants of Herod. And the Herodians worked closely with them. The Jewish leadership worked with the Roman leadership to maintain peace between the parties and also rule Jerusalem for their own power and profit. And they sought to destroy Christ. Here's the God himself who's come to earth to save them out of their grace, his grace. They were so threatened by him and their system, and they loved it so much that they wanted to kill him. And of course, they ultimately would. Okay, thank you for joining me today. What have we seen? We've seen two important stories about the Pharisees and their being threatened by Christ and wanting to destroy him, both over legalism and feeding themselves on the Sabbath day, the day of rest, as well as healing. So Christ rules over the Sabbath. The Sabbath is made for man, his rest and comfort, and ultimately type salvation. And we don't follow rules just to follow rules. Colossians, the end of Colossians 2 also reflects this for people in the church. Thanks for joining me today. We'll continue Christ's ministry next time. Please join me then.